The Resurrection by E. M. Bounds, Chapter 14. The resurrection of the saints is called the manifestation of the sons of God, the glorious liberty of the children of God, the adoption, the redemption of our bodies. It is the grand jubilee of the church, and even of the creation. Till then the former as well as the latter shall be held under a degree of bondage, as being yet subject to the effects of sin. But then Christ's promise shall be fulfilled. I will raise them up at the last day. And the deliverance of the saints will be the signal of that of the creation. Andrew Fuller. This able writer continues, the notion of the incorruptible germ, or that of an original and unchangeable stagnant, out of which a new and glorious body at the resurrection is to spring, appears to have been borrowed from the speculations of some of the Jewish rabbins, who speak of some such supposed part of the human frame under the name luz, to which they ascribe marvelous properties and from which the body was to arise. No allusion is, however, made to any such opinion by the early fathers in their defenses of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. On the contrary, they argue in such a way as to prove the possibility of the reunion of the scattered parts of the body, which sufficiently shows that the germ theory had not been resorted to by Christian divines, at least, in order to harmonize the doctrine of the resurrection with philosophy. So, Justin Martin, in a fragment of his concerning the resurrection, expressly answers the objection that it is impossible for the flesh, after a corruption and perfect dissolution of all its parts, to be united together again, and contends that if the body be not raised complete with all its integral parts, it would argue a want of power in God. And although some of the Jews adopted the notion of the germinating or springing up of the body from some one indestructible part, yet the most orthodox of their rabbis contended that the resurrection of the same body. So, Maimonides says, men in the same manner as they before lived with the same body shall be restored to life by God and set into this life with the same identity, and that nothing can properly be called a resurrection of the dead but the return of the very same soul into the very same body from which it was separated. This theory, under its various forms and whether adopted by Jews or Christians, was designed, doubtless, to render the doctrine of a resurrection from the dead less difficult to conceive and more acceptable to philosophic minds, but, like most other attempts of the same kind, to bring down the supernatural doctrines of revelation to the level of our conceptions, it escapes none of the original difficulties and involves itself in others far more perplexing. For if by this hypothesis it was designed to remove the difficulty of conceiving how the scattered parts of one body could be preserved from becoming integral parts of another body, it supposes that the constant care of providence is exerted to maintain the incorruptibility of those individual germs or stigma, so as to prevent their assimilation with each other. Now, if they have this by original quality, by the same quality may just as easily be supposed to appertain to each particle which composes a human body, so that, though it be used for food, it shall not be capable of assimilation in any circumstances with another human body. But if these germs, or stagnant, have not this quality of their original nature, they can be prevented from assimilating with each other only by that operation of God, which is present to all his works, and which must always be directed to secure the execution of its own ultimate designs. If this view be adopted, then, if the resort must at last be to the superintendency of a being of infinite power and wisdom, there is no greater difficulty in supposing that his care to secure this object shall exceed to 1,000,000 than to 1,000 particles of matter. This is, in fact, the true and rational answer to the objection that the same piece of matter may happen to be a part or two or more bodies, as in the incidence of men feeding upon animals which have fed upon men, and of men feeding upon one another. The question here is one which simply respects the frustrating of a final purpose of the Almighty by an operation of nature. To suppose that he cannot prevent this is to deny his power. To suppose him inattentive to it is to suppose him indifferent to his own designs. And to assume that he employs care to prevent it is to assume nothing greater. Nothing, in fact, is so great as many instances of control which are always occurring, as, for instance, the regulation of the proportion of the sexes in human births, which cannot be attributed to chance, but must either be referred to superintendency or to some original law. Thus, these theories afford no relief to the only real difficulty involved in the doctrine, but leave the whole case still to be resolved into the almighty power of God. But they involve themselves in the fatal objection that they are plainly in opposition to the doctrine of the Scriptures. For, number one, there is no resurrection of the body. On this hypothesis, because of the germ or stigma, can be no good sense be called the body. If a finger or even a limb is not the body, much less can these miniature parts be entitled to their application. Number two, there is on these theories no resurrection at all. For if the preserved part be a germ, and the analogy of germination be adopted, then we have no longer a resurrection from the dead, but a vegetation from a suspended principle of secret life. If the stigma of, spelled Leibnitz, be contended for, then the body into which the soul enters at the resurrection, with the exception of these minute stigma, is provided for by the addition and aggregation of new matter, and we have a creation, not a recreation, not a resurrection. Number three, if bodies in either of these modes are to be framed for the soul by the addition of a large mass of new matter, the resurrection is made substantially the same with the pagan notion of a metempsychosis. And if St. Paul at Athens preached not Jesus and the resurrection, but Jesus and a transmigration into a new body, it would be difficult to account for his hearers scoffing at a doctrine which had received the sanction of several of their own philosophical authorities. Another objection to the resurrection of the body has been drawn from the changes of its substance during life. The answer to this is that, allowing a frequent and total change of the resurrection of the body, which, however, is but a hypothesis, is to take place, it affects not the doctrine of the Scriptures, which is but that body which is laid in the grave shall be raised up. But then we are told that if our bodies have in fact undergone successive changes during life, the bodies in which we have sinned or performed rewardable actions may not be, in many instances, the same body as those which we will be actually rewarded or punished. We answer that rewards and punishments have their relations to the body, not so much as to the subject, but for the instrument of reward and punishment. It is the soul only that perceives pain and pleasure, which suffers or enjoys, and is therefore the only rewardable subject. Where we, therefore, to admit such corporal mutations as are assumed in this objection, they affect not the case of our accountability. The personal identity or sameness of a rational being, as Mr. Locke has observed, consists in self-consciousness. By this everyone is to himself what he calls self, without considering whether that self be continued in the same or diverse substances. It was by the same self which reflects on an action done many years ago, and that action was performed. If there were indeed any weight in this objection, it would affect the proceedings of human criminal courts in all cases of offenses committed at the same distance of time, but it contradicts the common sense because it contradicts the common consciousness and experience of mankind.